Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Dialogos and Mysticism. And I'm joined once again by my dear friends, Zevi Slavin and Guy Senstock. And well, first of all, gentlemen, please say hi.
Hi,
Hello,
John.
everybody.
Thanks for having us.
It's great. It's great to be back.
Yeah, so there's been a gap because something wonderful has happened. Guy has had a child. A newborn, and so congratulations and hooray. And
Yay. Yes.
Also tough.
Amazing.
So we're going to continue the series, and I'm going to begin by introducing the problem that we're going to wrestle with today, and then we'll enter into dialogue and hopefully dialogos. So we left off in the last time when we mentioned this issue, which is the debate between Buber and Jung, and this is important for a few reasons. If you remember, this is not a series about Buber, but Buber is serving as a foil because he starts out as sort of an avowed mystic. He sort of officially rejects that, turns to dialogue, what I think we would all agree is properly dialogos, and yet there are these mystical elements deep within the dialogos. So we've been exploring that tension, and that tension comes to a kind of an explicit place in the debate with Jung. And you can read the debate, you can read about the debate. So some of the core issues I want to introduce in the debate, and these are just by way of introduction. We're going to get into them. But I want to remind everybody, this is, again, not going to be focused on Buber and Jung. We're going to use them as, again, a foil for talking about dialogos and mysticism, but adding some dimensionality, or at least explicating this dimensionality. So the core of the debate between Buber and Jung is, I think, can at least initially be framed. It's not going to be sufficient. We're going to have to open it up as a debate between existentialism and psychology, and a specific version of psychology known as depth psychology, or it's sometimes called depth psychology, or it's called psychodynamic psychology. I like depth psychology because this form of psychology, typified by people like Freud and Jung, places a tremendous emphasis on the relationship between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. And what's interesting already about Jung for our project is Jung has at least what seems to be important dimensions within his understanding of the psyche. The psyche is his name for the entirety, both the conscious and the unconscious. There's an organizing principle of that he calls the self, like with a capital S. It's inspired by Atman within the Upanishads, and then there's an organizing organizing archetype for the conscious mind. That's the ego, and then Jung understands the process of healing and growth, and they overlap in Jung, as a dialogue, and I mean that deeply, a dialogue between the ego and the self. And so an inner dialogue is constitutive of the functioning, healing, and growth of the psyche. So that, of course, already gets us into one dimension of our discussion. Second, though, is that Jung is very clear that that relationship to the unconscious, the relationship between the ego and the self, is a spiritual, he often understands it this way, is a spiritual relationship in which individuals can have encounters with the numinous, and he uses that very explicitly, like Rudolf Otto does, and of course Rudolf Otto's definition is properly mystical because the tremendous mystery is at the core of the definition. So you see the mystical within Jung. John Durley has a way of talking about this that I think is very good. Jung sees the psyche as a sacrament. This is a a symbol that you participate in. So think of the Christian sacrament of the Eucharist. You participate in it, you consume it, you're one with it in order to enter into a deeper relationship with the divine, the sacred. So Jung has within the core principles of his model of the psychological functioning, growth, and healing, the dialogical and the mystical. They're there and they're profound and they're important. So you would think that perhaps that would make him somebody that Buber would like and appreciate and reach out to, but exactly opposite is the case. And I'll let Zevi go into some of the details, but the exchange between Buber and Jung, it becomes, I think it's fair to say, it becomes kind of nasty in places. And Buber says in I read a couple letters where he says something to the effect that the biggest threat around is Jung's psychology. And it's like, whoa, like what's going on? And why is this so threatening? It's fair to say that because he invokes the notion of a threat. So we'll explore this a bit, but the key seems to be that Buber is, and he uses the term in places that I've read, I don't know how extensively he uses it, but he accuses Jung of what is called psychologism. So this notion goes back most prominently to Frege, and let's very quickly what it means, what the concern is. So Frege's concern was about logic. And the point about logic is that logical relations are supposed to have necessity to them. If P, then Q, P, therefore necessarily Q. There's a necessity to them, and that necessity gives an overarching normativity to them. The problem that Frege was worried about is that people who are psychologically studying inference, seeing how people make inferences, right? That's a descriptive enterprise because the events happening in people's minds are purely contingent, causal events. They don't have the necessity of logic has, and they don't have any normativity. Therefore, in fact, we tend to judge our inferences against the normativity of logic, which means logic has to be independent of our psychological processes to serve as a guide. And so psychologism, at least initially, meant trying to replace logic, which has a more transcendental status, with the empirical processes of psychology. And so what that means is, like like especially people like Frege would want to say something like the truths of logic are true even if there are no human beings. But obviously it can't possibly be true that human reasoning could exist independently of human beings. So there's a deep, deep difference there. Okay. Now, Buber is not talking properly about logic, but he's talking as an existentialist. So what's the fundamental difference between an existentialist and psychologist? And the lines blur because there are people who call themselves existential psychologists, and I'll give you another important blurring or at least integrating person. I'll talk about Tillich in a few minutes. Here, so what is existentialism? So the basic idea coming out of Heidegger, Heidegger was loath to describe himself as an existentialist. Sartre was happy to because Sartre was ruthlessly self-promotional. The basic idea is this, and I like Charles Taylor's take on existentialism. And I'm going to invoke Charles Taylor because I'm a Canadian, and therefore Charles Taylor is the most important authority on this, because if you don't know, he's a Canadian philosopher. So Charles Taylor's point is, right there, and Taylor's right, this goes back to an aspect of the Stoics. There is a fundamental difference between human beings and other organisms, other animals. So when a gazelle is born, a gazelle has an essence. And we can, essentially, I'm not going to get into whether it's an Aristotelian. What it means is the gazelle is a gazelle. There's no problem in its being a gazelle. It has problems of surviving and reproducing, but it's not like, how do I be a good gazelle? Like, I think I'm losing my way towards gazellehood, right? None of that makes any sense. So for them to use this language, essence precedes their existence. Their existence just unfolds from the structural functional organization that is given to them by nature. Human beings, and this is Taylor's point, are self-defining, self-interpreting, right? And to use Heidegger's famous formulation, we are the beings whose being is in question. That is why we have a fundamental relationship to the question of being, right? That's Heidegger's sort of philosophy in a nutshell. And I hope that's not insulting, but because we are the beings for whom being is in question, we are the beings that for whom the question of being is fundamental to us. So existentialism has those two poles to it, right? Self-defining, self-interpreting means we are the beings whose beings are in question. We can seriously wonder, am I a good person? Who am I? What am I supposed to be? What's the meaning of my life? And we can ask questions about that, and they're always in a creative tension with questions of, well, what is being? What is it to be? What is the goodness of being? That whole project is not specific, right? And this is what we'll have to be careful. That whole project is not specific to the psychological history of any particular human being. Let me say that again. That project is not specific to the psychological history of any human being. Heidegger's deeply influenced by Kierkegaard. Some human beings might not face this project. They turn away from it. There's inauthenticity. There's a critique there. I'll just put that out there because I want to concentrate on the point that Heidegger, and I also Sartre, Gabriel Marcel are making, Camus, is that project is existential and not so because it's constitutive of, because our capacity and need to be self-defining, self-interpreting, calling ourselves into question, and also simultaneously calling being into question or raising the question of being, that is constitutive of our personhood, of our being a human person. And therefore, it is not, it is in that sense a universal feature, like the universality of logic. Obviously, it wouldn't exist if there's no human beings, but it's not bound to the psychological history and development of any particular person. So that's existentialism is a deep philosophical reflection on that structure, that we are self-interpreting, calling ourselves into question, and therefore we're raising the question of being, and we're raising the question of the relationship between those. And that is a project of personhood. That is not the project of John Vervaeke, right? It's the project of personhood, of my being in the world as a person, as a moral agent, as a reflective self, in community with other persons. Okay, now the issue is, and this comes up in the Elusive Eye series that I did with Greg Enriquez and Christopher Mastropietro, but surely there's a deep relationship between me becoming a person and me becoming John Vervaeke. Are those projects really deeply separable? And surely there are deep aspects of me becoming John Vervaeke that are completely responsible to and caused by my idiosyncratic history. I could have, for example, I could have been born in Spain and I wouldn't be speaking English, and I would be exposed to Spanish culture rather than Canadian culture, et cetera, right? And that would go into who I am, even what myself is. So this is the problem. The problem is there is a real difference, as I've tried to explain, between the existential study of a person and the psychological study of the psyche, but they are not, they also interpenetrate and overlap. And I think so that's why the people that are closest to us have the capacity to, worry us the most and concern us the most. And I think because Jung is doing psychology that has dialogos and the mystical properly within it, and he's talking about this process of individuation, the process by which I become my authentic self. That sounds to Buber a lot like what he's talking about with dialogue and the mystical, and the process of becoming authentically oneself in relationship to others. And this, I think, pisses him off because he's worried that Jung is making an existential phenomenon into a psychological one, and then thereby losing something crucial and essential, the existential dimension of how human beings are self-interpreting, self-defining beings. So that's the nature of the problem. Now, I want to point out that this interpenetration is sometimes, instead of being backgrounded and the difference being emphasized, like in the debate, the interpenetration is emphasized. And a figure who does that, to my mind, very prominently and importantly, is Paul Tillich, especially in something like The Courage to Be.
Yeah.
So Tillich, first of all, Tillich is clear and explicit that he is trying to integrate depth psychology with existential philosophy and theology. He explicitly says that, he references it. And it's interesting that when Durley is talking about the psyche as sacrament, that's the name of Durley's book, he talks about both Jung and Tillich. It's in the title, right? Jung and Tillich, and the psyche as sacrament. Because Tillich is very much appreciative in both senses of the word of Jung's proposal that the depths of the psyche are sacred in some important way. It's kind of an existential depth psychological version of the soul, if you want it that way. And don't forget, Jung entitled one of his books, Modern Man in Search of a Soul. So again, I'm not imposing, I don't think, in any way on them. The interesting thing about Tillich is he uses the term individuation, I think because of Jung. He says, yes, we have this individuation project, but Tillich he's an existentialist too. And so the relationship to being, and the being of others, and what he calls the ground of being itself, is also important and sacred. And so he has this other thing he calls participation, and he's directly, obviously, putting his finger on the Platonic tradition and the Platonic idea that we're after these two things: peace within the soul and the contact with the deepest aspect of reality. And so for Tillich, there is an existential tension between individuation and participation, and the existential and the depth psychological. So that relationship of our self-defining, self-interpreting, and the relationship between the ego and the self, the conscious and the unconscious, they interpenetrate. And the individuation and participation. So there's an ongoing dialectic, a tonos, a creative tension. And Tillich sees the relationship between human beings and God. For Tillich, God is the ground of being, as he called it the method of correlation, but it's a dialogical relation, which is human beings pose questions, but the questions have to be answered by the ground of being, from the ground of being. Because if human beings answer the questions, right, they can't get the relationship to reality that they need. So they're self-interpreting, self-defining insofar as they ask the questions, but they seek a kind of dialogical relationship to something that is ultimate in order to receive the transformative answers to those questions. So Tillich, right, is in a sense somebody that offers an alternative to the Buber and Jung debate. So that's, I hope, a good or helpful introduction. I want to point to a book that I found helpful, The Search for Roots, C.J. Jung and the Tradition of Gnosis by Alfred Riebe. As I said, there's the second chapter is explicitly on the debate, and then that reverberates through. I'll warn you, and so that you will read other books. Riebe is ultimately a Jungian, and he will take Jung's side, mostly fairly. A couple places I think he wasn't properly fair to Buber, but hopefully we might also talk about the topic that comes up here, which is exactly Gnosis, because Gnosis seems to be the kind of knowing that lies on the boundary between the existential and the psychological. You can clearly see that, for example, in the work of Hans Jonas. You can see it here. And so Merker has a similar idea in his book on Gnosis. And so I want to hopefully we'll get to that. And where is Gnosis within Dialogos and in mystical realization? So I'll shut up because I've talked a lot, but that's me trying to set up the framework within which we can have our discussion today. So I'm going to turn it over first. Maybe some quick initial reactions from both, and then turn it over to Zevi to give his longer take on this. Maybe just some initial reactions from both of you. Guy, do you want to go first?
Well, you did a great setup, because I'm already having thoughts about. Yes, it's the dialectic is already happening. You set up all the tensions really well, and they're deep questions, and they're also, I think one access point that we could look at as kind of a study about this thing between the personal and the existential.
Yeah.
Is our course that we did.
Yes.
And
yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that was an example of the two deeply not only fitting together, but informing each other. And so I think that's one of the things that we've been having our eye on with the Dialogos and what we've been discovering.
Yeah. I thank you, Guy. That's an excellent proposal. Zebi, we'll talk a little bit about the workshop, but I think that's a good way of trying to bring this tension into at least the Dialogos aspect. So Zebi, how would you like to respond?
Yeah, I'm glad we have 10 hours to even begin to open up everything that's being put on the table here. I mean, wow, that's we have a lot of work set ahead of us if we're going to do justice to any of that. I really like the layup that you've given of juxtaposing the psychologist or the psychologizationism versus the existential going on here, and whether that's I think depending on what word we'll use is whether that's a legitimate thing to be doing or it's something that we should be concerned about and see as a threat, as Buber saw it.
Right.
I really do appreciate the way that you brought Tillich in as a third figure to mediate between those two. To me, I want to maybe and the question of individuation and the inherent problematic and paradox between individuating as the Zevi, the John, the Guy that we are in the languages and the cultures and the context that we're given, and the human project as a whole, and that as perhaps framing a large difference of perspective between the psychologist and the existentialist, and the overlap there is very rich, as you've laid out. I want to lay in perhaps another pane of glass to see this conversation through as well, which is how I've been reading the Jung-Buber debate. And I think it very much relates to this. Just to give a bit of historical background to the debate. So the debate kicks off properly in 1952 with an article that's entitled "Religion and Modern Thinking," that appears in a German magazine called Merker, and the responses between Jung and Buber go on in that journal itself. I'm drawing here from Barbara Stevens. She wrote a great article. She's also a Jungian, which is interesting to see another Jungian address the Buber debate, and herself trying to be not too partial and trying to hear out Buber, and I think she does actually a good job with that. The article is called "The Modern Buber-Carl Jung Disputations: Protecting the Sacred in the Battle for the Boundaries of Analytical Psychology." I recommend that, 2001. In this article that Buber publishes, which is actually a reprint of a chapter from an earlier work, and it ends up being published all in a work of his called "Eclipse of God," later, Buber is going on his themes of reality, religion, philosophy, ethics, and he goes on to attack three people specifically: a German, a French, and a Swiss. He attacks the existentialist Heidegger, although, as you said, he himself didn't reject that term, whatever it is, whatever his label is, modern Heidegger. He attacks Jean-Paul Sartre for the Americans and Canadians, and he attacks the Swiss Carl Jung, who's the focus of today's discussion, along with Buber. And his critique of them, or what really unifies his critique of the three is, and this is a quote of his, that the radical subjectivism of modern thought that he feels has blocked access to the transcendent, which results, in his opinion, in spiritual blindness to the living presence of God. These are his words, and he calls that the eclipse of God, and that's what he sees as the big threat of modernity. And it's very true what you said, John, that sometimes we don't see that the enemy that's very far away doesn't seem very threatening to us, because we know that they're not in real discussion with us, right? So the staunch theist and the staunch atheist, they're enemies, but there isn't a lot of love lost between them. But between the co-religionists, and the closer you are to home, the closer the relative, the more ferocious the fight can be. So I see this fight between Buber and Jung, and as you said, it actually at sometimes devolves into some things which you wouldn't expect from gentlemen. And I see it just as a sign of their real closeness, and how much they were concerned that the influence that was being brought by the other in a way that was so close to us be done in a way that wasn't corrupting their own field. I know. I'm very passionate about philosophy of mysticism, and what irks me the most is seeing people doing mysticism in a very non-rigorous way, in a way that describes. And I don't care if someone's talking about, they could be talking about theories of nutrition and making things up, and that doesn't bother me. Once they talk about mysticism, which I think there's like so much that the world needs for it to be done properly, so I can see that Buber and Jung both care so much that they want to be properly understood, and they're both doing it in response to real existential issues. They're both talking in response to World War II and a lot of World War I, a lot of madness around them. So I do see even their bitterness to one another, the accusation that clearly the other hasn't even read my works, which is very clear that they both read each other's works extensively. Jung writes at one point that it's very clear that Buber just doesn't understand Immanuel Kant, and that's why there's no discussion here. He hasn't read Critique of Pure Reason carefully enough, or else we wouldn't be having this talk. And he really gets quite nasty at some points. But I just want to talk about this critique of Buber's for a second, and then lay that in as an additional panel to what we talked about. Buber writes this one paragraph, and this I think is the crux of Buber's critique against all three, and particularly against Jung, because when he's writing about all three, about 50% of the quotations that he brings in his critique are quotations from Jung. So while Heidegger and Sartre are important to him in his critique, it's clearly Jung who's the main antagonist, and they blossom into this disputation, which becomes quite famous. And Buber writes like this, and he's very particular with his words. Man, we would now say mankind, or man or woman, but I'm just going to use the gender language that he uses. Man now draws back the projections of his self, of a God outside of him, without thereby wishing to deify himself. Man does not deny a transcendent God, he simply dispenses with him. He no longer knows the unrecognizable. He no longer needs to pretend to know him. In his place, he knows the soul, or rather the self. Clearly a sting at Jung. It is indeed not a God that modern consciousness abhors, which is a response to a quote from Jung that the modern consciousness abhors God, but faith is what the modern consciousness abhors, according to Buber. Whatever may be the case concerning God, the important thing for man of modern consciousness is to stand in no further relationship of faith to him. So there's something interesting going on here, and I want to bring in this theological language, and I hope that the viewers who don't care much for theology don't run away once with a bit of God talk, because I think when they're speaking about God, they're talking about something much more than what we think what that word means, and I'll try to explain what that means in a second. I think for Jung and Buber. Buber, throughout the debate with Jung, is on the facade, he's criticizing the fact that Jung rejects this, that there is an ontological thing out there which we can call the divine, the unknowable, the transcendent. And he criticizes, he gets quite specific in his critique of Jung. He says that Jung claims to be a psychologist and claims not to be talking about metaphysics or ontology, and yet he makes claims in the negation of the existence of God, saying that such a being cannot exist or cannot be known. And he says that is a metaphysical claim, and you're no longer just being a psychologist, so you can't hide behind that label. And Buber, and that they go back and forth in that in a way that gets almost a little petty, which we don't want to focus on here. But the important point, I think, is that Buber is saying to Jung that what you're doing is not only are you saying that there's no greater being outside of us called God, there's no relationship to anything outside of us at all. And the real threat of psychologization for Buber is this fact that there's no relationship, not whether or not there's a God or not. Like, Buber is not some sort of Bible bashing theist who cares to prove the existence of God. Buber cares about relationship, and relationship means there needs to be something real outside of you. And if all you're ever relating to, even in your deepest experiences, is just the self and more of the self and more of the self, there is no relationship. There is no I thou. And I take Buber's critique seriously as someone who has a worldview which is very much centered around monism, idealism, mysticism. This is a very real critique. And this is, I think, the brunt of his critique against Jung. And I think this question of the being of other and the grounded being, right? So is the grounded being only locused within the self, or is it outside or in between, as Buber likes to see it? If the depth of the self, as we're saying, the sort of new Platonic idea that the truest depth of the self, the Atman, is the Brahman, the depth of the self is the depth of the reality, where is the space for relationship to something outside of us, to other? And that question of where ultimate being is, and if there is ultimate being outside, I think is the real debate here. And we spoke last time, perhaps, some psychological explanations of why this is so important to Buber, his abandonment by his mother at the age of 3 and all kinds of other things. But putting aside those kinds of explanations, because those tend to be just reductionistic, the point is a very real one, that in a psychologization, not only are we abandoning the capacity to identify with the human subspecies humanitarian or subspecies humanus, whatever the Latin would be, that we're part of a project which is bigger than just the self. And individuation is not just psychologized to the individual to become the truest I that I can be, but there's something outside of me, there's something real outside of me that I can connect to. And the space between whether this real is within me, is outside of me, is a tricky thing. And I think that bringing Tillich and bringing the language of participation, which we brought up last time, which I think has been really helpful and has been actually reshaping my thinking around these issues, is really an important space to work between these two great thinkers. So just to conclude this remark, I think that the initial question of when I first read Eclipse of God when I was, I don't know, like 17 or 18, like, to me, some coming from religious backgrounds, interested in psychology and philosophy, the question was, is God a real thing out there, or is God just in our mind? And to me, that was a real question. I was really chewing over that. And now when I read the debate, I'm reading a different debate. I'm reading the question of, are we really relating to something that's really other and inside of us, or are we only ever relating to the self? And that's my 2 cents.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
So the invocation by Jung of Kant is relevant to that point you just made, Zevi. And I keep saying this, people don't take how serious of a Kantian Jung was, all right? And so Kant is invoking the critique of pure reason, Jung is invoking the critique of pure reason, in which Kant, sort of convincingly to many people, I have criticisms, but I'm trying to get into Jung's mind right now. Kant, shows the impossibility of metaphysics as a project, right? And so Jung thinks that anything metaphysical is precluded when we're trying to do science, and therefore he doesn't want to talk about this. Now, I'm going to try and go back and forth. To give Buber his point, a lot of people don't know this about Jung. As Jung goes deeper and deeper, and by the 50s, we're getting towards the end of Jung's career, right? Jung starts talking about the psychoidal. And the psychoidal is something that extends beyond the psyche. It has a transpersonal, this is where transpersonal psychology comes out of, right? So the idea, the Gnostic and the Neoplatonic elements that had always run through Jung and be very important, become more and more prominent in Jung. And you can look at the current work of Jeffrey Raff, the alchemical imagination. And so, for example, the figure of Sophia, right, is psychoidal. Sophia is not just an archetype in the psyche, but somehow a perennial pattern within the external world. And Sophia is the psychoidal bridges between those in some way. I would use Corbin's term. They're talking about the imaginal here, right? And Jung is also being deeply influenced by Corbin through all of this too. And I think the psychoidal is his way of trying to acknowledge the imaginal, what I call the transjective, and see that there's a sacredness in the between space, not just the within space. So I take it that we have to be careful, because I'm not trying to negate Buber's critique, but what I'm saying is actually there's a conflict within Jung about exactly this topic, right? And I think because Jung was coming to increasingly realize existential participation and self-definition, self-interpretation that are integral to his understanding of individuation take place, because he has to account for the therapeutic relation. Like what's going on if it's all like right? And so he has to acknowledge the deep interconnection between the inner dialogue and the outer dialogue. And therapy is properly, when I think it's done properly, is a kind of dialogos, right? And he's got to, right? And so he starts to bend his metaphysics, and he starts to introduce metaphysics. And so I think, although this sounds like a defense of Jung, it's actually an exoneration of Buber, because Buber's critique actually, I think, holds, because you see Jung actually having to give way on it in his theoretical project and in his theoretical work. Now, like I said, I think what that brings up is that, and again, given especially Tillich, I think that brings up something I'd like to focus in on, which is the crux then, if we get rid of sort of that, I don't mean get rid of, if we addressed it, I think the crux of the issue is exactly one that Zevi put his finger on, which is, the notion of faith and how it transcends subjectivism and egocentrism and sort of a Kantian self-enclosure, right? And that faith, and notice what that requires. That requires a pre-modern notion of faith, where faith is not the assertion of belief, but exactly that sense of participating in right relationship with something other than yourself that transforms you. Like that, and that's why sexual intercourse metaphors are repeatedly used in different sacred traditions. It's clearly in the Bible. It's in, it's in the Upanishads. It's all over the place, right? As a primary metaphor. And so the question then, I think, is, and I'm going to use the ancient word, so because our word faith, people they use faith and belief as synonyms. So I want to step out of that. I want to use the ancient term pistis, to mean that what I just talked about, that sense of being in right relationship, and you're conforming to some other that is therefore transformative of you, and you only know them in the transformation of your own self-knowledge. So your self-knowledge and your relationship to them and how you're conforming to them are inextricably bound together. And that's a Platonic proposal as well. So here's the question, that pistis means all of that. And this is an ancient debate, and it runs through, right, the mystical tradition. What's the relationship between pistis and gnosis? Because Jung clearly, centrally, has a place for gnosis. And I think Tillich exemplifies it because of how gnosis lies on this fecund juncture between the existential and the psychological, right? And of course, the groups of people that were called Gnostics, the Gnostics aren't like a church, they're more like a style, like fundamentalism, right? But the Gnostics are, like Hans Jonas sees them as existential, other people see them as depth psychological, and that's not a coincidence. Many people have, I think, quite correctly said that what Jung was doing was revalorizing Gnosticism for the modern age. And this is in the title here, The Search for Roots, C.J. Jung and the Tradition of Gnosis. So the question, I think, then comes down to this question of what's the relationship? They're not the same, and they historically entered into conflict. Early Christianity is wrestling with, are we based on pistis or are we based on gnosis, right? And it lasts for centuries, right? I think maybe this is the question, and then what I want to ask is, what do the dialogical and the mystical have to say about the relationship between pistis and gnosis? How's that for taking us another step further? Is that okay?
hang on a second. I just have a quick, can you summarize just really quick, Gnosis and Pistis, so I have the two really distinct. Just, is there just a brief summary? The
So
bottom line, essentially.
And the question is, are they ultimately fundamentally different, or are they?
Yeah, because I thought before you said I was like, oh, I thought maybe that was Gnosis that you were describing before you distinguish it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So the difference comes down to, and perhaps it's a difference of emphasis, but I'm posing it as an open question, and I think it's a question that's at the core of Dialogos and the mystical. Right at the core, right?
Mm.
I would put it this way: and again, they are on this juncture point between the existential and the psychological, right? And I mean the existential in that deep ontological sense I tried to lay out, right? But I would say Pistis emphasizes right relationship, and Gnosis ultimately emphasizes a kind of knowing. I would call it participatory, transformative knowing, but it's a kind of knowing, right? Where, right, and so one thing that's the notion of love is more at home within Pistis than it is within Gnosis. I'm not saying the Gnostics don't talk about love, but the Gnostics put much more emphasis on knowledge and wisdom than they do on love and being in right relationship. Now, there's a lot of overlap. Exactly. That's exactly what your reaction, but that's the emphasis. And you see how that kind of maps on to the existential and the Gnostic and the psychological, at least Jungian depth psychological.
Can I bring in a word from Jung on the distinction between Pistis and Gnosis in this
Please.
regard?
Yeah.
Because this ties very interestingly back into their own the Jung-Buber debate.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say one thing before that, which is that there's this constant sort of bullying by Jung against Buber that he just doesn't understand Kant at all, and that's just where he goes wrong. And you brought Kant's critique. I just, in defense of Buber, because I feel close to him. Buber, when he was like 17, writes in his diary how he discovered Kant's Prolegomena to any future metaphysics, and how he describes the book, how it changed his life, and how he lived with it, and it was his Bible, and like. So any notion that Buber wasn't aware of or thoroughly versed in or influenced by or transformed by Kant is just simply not fair. So to all the Jungians out there, that's for Buber.
And I think Buber I just overheard Buber say to you, the primal word was spoken. Thank you. He felt down by you.
Welcome. There's another funny thing is because Jung is very witty in his letters. Buber accuses Jung of being a Gnostic, right? Yeah. And he accuses him based on a few things. One time he refers to God under a Gnostic name, and another thing, a poem that he had written that Buber says, I was just drunk at a party when I wrote it. I didn't mean it to become used as blackmail against me. So that's an interesting part of the debate. And Jung writes very wittily. He says, you, Buber, are accusing me of being a Gnostic. There was a Christian theologian who's accusing Jung of being an agnostic, right? And he says, if you think about it, Gnostic and agnostic are literally opposite things. So if I'm being accused of both, it stands to reason that I'm either not being understood or you guys don't understand these categories. And he's doing something cheeky there because they're only antinomies in a literal sense. But it made me laugh when I read that. So this accusation of Gnostic, and when Buber means it, he means that when he's accusing Jung, he means that he's sort of devaluing or demonizing or dualizing the world, or presenting some sort of evil God, and you see that in Answer to Job and other places. And although Jung deflects the criticism because he's trying to play this card of, hey, I'm just a psychologist, I'm just a scientist. It's very clear that he has Gnostic themes running through him. So in terms of Pistis and Gnosis, Pistis. So I can't recommend reading this letter. I sent this letter in email to both of you. It's a letter which Jung responds to a certain Bernard Ling, June 1957. You can find it online very easily if you Google that. And the letter I think it's a must read for any religious person, for anyone that's interested in religious experience and theory of religion. It's just a stunning letter, a brilliant letter of brilliance, and both of these men are just such brilliance in.
Yes,
and
yes.
The Clash is a brilliant one. So Jung himself in this letter writes that while he's not going to say that he believes in God, he says that he can better say that he has pistis. He says, so when you ask me if I'm a believer, this is the question that was posed to him by Bernard Lang. He says, I must answer no. He says, I am loyal to my inner experience and have pistis in the Pauline sense. And pistis in psychology and religion, another word he himself, Jung, defines as trust or loyalty, faith and confidence in a certain experience of a numinous nature. And this is really the key theme throughout this letter, this specific letter, where Jung stands behind the experience and he differentiates between the experience and the interpretation. And he says that when we try to give an interpretation of our numinous experience, what we're doing is we're saying that this experience, which we believe to be transcendent, I now can say that it's within my grip to interpret, and that my interpretation is right and everyone else is wrong. And he really goes hard on that point, and he really pushes for a subjectivism. He says that if we respect the numinous experience enough, we will try not to interpret it, but just to live in the experience itself and see what the experience itself has to teach and demand for us. And so pistis versus gnosis in relationship to the numinous experience, I think in Jung's own conception, as far as I can guess, is that pistis means I've had the experience of the numinous and I have faith and loyalty in that experience. And he actually references the conversion event of Paul on the road to Damascus in 1 Corinthians 12:9. And it's holding on to that experience and not interpreting it. I think gnosis for Jung would mean moving from the faith in that experience itself to an interpretation of the experience, to knowing reality based on that experience, right? To I now have a participatory or propositional grip on what happened, and that knowing unites me and brings me into right reconciliation and salvation with that numinous divine reality. And so I think pistis means that he's not going into gnosis. He's saying, I don't know. He's saying, I am agnostic, at least he claims, I am agnostic about the ultimate claims that this experience makes in any sort of a priori or categorical universal way, but I have pistis in the transformation of the experience itself, and that's a fact for me.
So I want to push back on that, because I think what he's doing is that's a dodge. I think he's collapsing the difference between pistis and gnosis. At the very end, in the very famous interview, he was asked if he believed in God, and he says, I don't believe, I know. And that's a claim of a Gnostic, right? That's the claim that the experience ultimately grounds the ability to say, I know. And the faith in the experience and the transformation, right? That's ultimately the Gnostic faith, because the Gnostic, and this is a point many people make, the Gnostic emphasizes an experience of transformation with respect to God, as opposed to the otherness and the independence. In fact, the otherness, right, is given a very negative understanding, except for the otherness of the ultimate non-God, right? So what I'm saying is, I think you're right that that's what Jung is saying, and why I bring it up. But I think he's actually, that's a dodge. I think he's collapsing the distinction between them. What he's saying is, I'm experiencing transformation, and I have faith that this transformation is going to keep going. But that's gnosis. That's what gnosis is. It's the experience of transformation, and that transformation is saving you. That's the defining feature of gnosis, right? Whereas pistis is so supposed to be, I'm in relationship, and the otherness and the beyondness is constitutive of the relationship. And for him to, what's Paul's response? His response is, Jesus is Lord, not, hey, I'm being saved, right? That, and so again, I think Jung is, I think that's, I don't want to besmirch that's a great letter. I agree with you, it is, but I'm saying I'm very critical of that. And I think that's a move where Jung is not being fair to how these terms are being, and I don't think he's being fair to Paul's Damascus experience at all.
Rightfully so. I want to step down for a second and hear Guy's voice as well.
Yeah. Sorry.
Going back, I feel like we can get caught in this, but I think that you're right, and I think that what Jung does around these letters and debates is very slippery, and he very much retreats into a position where he's like, oh, I'm not a Gnostic, I'm not a metaphysician, I'm not a theologian, and then at other times he'll say, I know, and he makes these incredibly Gnostic. So I think you're right in saying that what he's doing here is an obfuscation of categories that he really is mashing together. But I'd love to bring in Guy and hear you.
I'm loving this. I'm this distinction, this dialectic between Gnosis and Pistis is striking to me. Because I'm just seeing flashes of arguments I've seen people have and complaints about each other. Like the classic one is get out of your head. Like, just don't interpret, right? Just be with the experience of, which it seems like Pistis, right? And then there's the other side, which is more, I guess, more Gnosis, right? Which is deeply understand and be transformed by it, right? It's through the understanding, is through knowing, right? Those two things. And there's even in the human potential movement groups, and like there's that debate, right?
Yeah.
Which in itself, that it seems to be an argument that comes up in multiple contexts as we're talking about. What does that, without them explicitly knowing about these things, right? But yet we're seeing that argument, like even at a local pre-reflective level, socially, in like personal growth groups, right? There's that debate.
Yeah.
So what is that reveal about the phenomena that we're talking about? That's the question I want to look at, and I'm wondering if that it's popping up like that, right? In multiple levels, if that in itself starts to get at the thing that starts to bring it more into resolution. So a couple of things I would say one place that I've had experience with, who A.H. Almas started something called here in Berkeley, called the Diamond Heart work, and and he's a psychologist, and he started working with, I think, he really comes from like an Eastern and a Sufi perspective, and a pretty deep one. But he's also like heavy duty objects relations psychologist.
Right.
And what makes his work really unique, and what I really liked about it, is that he was saying that, like, not only is the psychological and the transpersonal, right, or the archetypal, right, or the unitary, not only are they not different, but you actually, the likelihood that unless you go through the personal, right, the likelihood that you'll be able to actually see the transpersonal, right, starts to be diminished, right? And what he the way he puts it, he says that the East and a lot of the religious logos really talked a lot about the structure of, like, the ego, or the structure of the world, right? Or as a structure, the entity, the ego. Whereas psychology came in and started to not only talk about just the structure of the ego, but the substructures of the ego, and there's all the different theories about what makes that up, like everything from objects relations and internalized, right, parental figures and all of that kind of stuff, right? And he's like, this has only been like for 100 years if we actually kind of opened up at this level. So his project, right, basically he started a religion, right? It's called Diamond Heart. His project is bringing these two together in a very, very deep, and he's a very descriptive, technical way, bringing them together. But guess what? You know what his main method is? His methodology through this whole thing, the actual practices?
Inquiry.
Yeah. What he calls it is Socratic inquiry.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And he emphasizes that a lot. And I think that that's really interesting because there is a sense, and this has actually been my experience too, with circling. When you get someone's world, usually people don't usually start off talking about, you ask about their life, they usually don't start off talking about, well, the one,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
one, it's normally, oh, my mom, or, my wife, or,
yeah,
but one thing I found is that if you can be with that in an open way, right, in a Socratic way, in an inquiry way, that you could start to get that any one of those threads, if you just keep pulling on that thread, eventually you're going to start to get into these deeper conversations. And I've seen that over and over and over and over again, where it's kind of like, it's like if you just look at if all you see are these four fingers, and then eventually you come down, and pretty soon you're gonna, as that gets revealed,
right.
that the psyche, right, in the particular, that if you unfold it, right, in I think something around like dialogue and
Yes.
dialogos starts
Yeah.
to reveal this. And I think that's part of what we saw in our course, where we brought those two together. So those are some of my responses, and just to what I'm seeing here.
I think bringing in the Socratic dimension, I think, is important. And I agree with you. The course we did shows like that juncture point is profound, and perhaps it's more important than the two poles for people in trying to separate the depth psychological from the existential. What happens is, people, there's a dialogue between the existential and the depth psychological that is going on as they're dialoguing with other people. And then what happens in the Socratic fashion is that the self-knowledge and knowledge of the other that then gets dialoguing into, but what is being itself, or what is wisdom, and they get into those three dimensions, and we're writing about that, and that I think that was unquestionably, I think this is the right verb, demonstrated in the course. I think, very much. But for me, so there's two possible responses to you, and then I'll let Zevi talk. One is, well, does that mean the Pistis Gnosis distinction is actually a false distinction? And it seems that that's not right, because it seems like Jung is like conflating things that shouldn't be conflated. Buber has a point. There's a point to the debate, even if it gets vociferous, right? So I don't want to do that, but that's what I meant when I want to understand in a Socratic fashion, Pistis and Gnosis, and then now you brought up Socrates, and this is the right thing to bring up, Eros. Like there's those three, and because Pistis talks to love, and right, like I said, a lot, and there's agape, and then Gnosis has something too. It's not love, but it's this Eros, the desire to return, the profound longing to return that's supposed to motivate the Gnostic journey. And we see all three of those. So I'm acknowledging that I see all three of those deeply interpenetrating in Dialogos, right? Especially when Dialogos moves towards the mystical. So, but that's not the same as understanding their relation. I want to understand the relation, right? I acknowledge what you're saying. I think it's profound and right. But right? So, for example, Socratic inquiry, right? That's very much like Tillich. Now, is that an act of coming to understanding? Is that an act of coming into right relationship? Right? Is that an act of returning to the source of being? Like, right? Do you see what I'm saying? That's what I want to understand. So when Dialogos is on the horizon of the mystical, what is the relationship between Pistis and Gnosis and Eros and agape? That's
yes.
Yeah, I think it's a very specific. It's good to have that specificity in language in terms of questioning what it is we're trying to figure out. I want to step away from the language a little. I'm feeling slightly alienated by the language. I don't feel like it's my language. I want to bring us to our own experience here. Like, what are we doing here? Like, three people who spend a lot of their time thinking and reading, Um, John took the initiative to get the three of us to sit together, not the first time to record, to talk, to listen, to hear, to share, to explore, to debate and disagree, and to educate, hopefully, somehow ourselves and others. What I see here is a real combination of a lot of those categories, a lot of those words that we're talking about, right? There's an agape. We love this. We love coming here to sit together.
Yeah.
We care about it. We care about the world and the people in it and how they're living and the narratives which they're living in, and the metaphysics which are shaping their lives. There's some grasping for knowledge. We're not just trying to make art and poetry. We're trying to come to a knowledge about what a thing is, and to be in reconciliation and demonstration with that, and to demonstrate that in the Socratic method of sitting here and talking together. And I think that I may not have an analytical answer to separate linguistically where each of those things sit between mysticism and dialogos. But I think if we examine what we're doing here in this moment, we're doing those things. We're doing all of the above, and I feel driven into this moment by all of those things.
Yeah.
Let's do it. I think that's a great proposal. If the terms make you comfortable, I'm just using the terms to try and point to something, because there's a knowing. One of the central claims of Gnosis, right, that distinguishes it from the Cartesian project, is that there are truths that are only accessible through transformation, right? That there's levels of reality. So Descartes is the idea, Descartes and Locke. No, I just have to have a universal method and it will get me all the truths that are possible to be gotten, right? But if you look at somebody like the Christian tradition emphasizes this, but I think this is something that the Gnostic, right, made central. Like, no, there are aspects of reality, hidden aspects of reality that are only accessible in transformation. So this is the Gnostic aspect I'm feeling in our conversation, that we are not only talking to each other, because that's not dialogos. We are trying to provoke emergence. We are trying to provoke transformation in each other. That's the Gnosis. For me, the Pistis is the sense that you two have both become deep friends of mine, such that I feel that both the world and myself are better because I'm in relationship to both of you, and that you're in that world, and that I want to care and take care of that relationship. But those two things, although you can distinguish them in thought, for me, they are bound up, because if I think this is right, if I didn't trust you as friends, I couldn't engage in the transformation for the truth, right? It's almost like trothing, betrothed, where the word troth points to both trust and to truth. Yeah. There's a trothing going on that's at the core of, for me, that's my attempt to give an initial way of bringing it into the concrete guts of what we're doing right now.
First of all, Zevi, I really like what you just did. Like, where basically you pulled it right into here, right into now. Like, and when you did that,
that's because of Zevi, right? One of my besetting sins is I'm able to spin off into abstract theory very easily. So I thank you for that. Yeah.
Right. What Zevi did is just I felt the logical level become present, right, to me, or into my awareness that was background at some level. And so, for example, like with John, what I've come to understand is, like, when you're going off into theory, actually what I feel is love. It's like you're loving. Right. And I would say that the one thing that it seems that we have in common, that I hope that our friendships just continue to deepen, and I think they will, because there is a commonality to something inexhaustible that we care about, right? And therefore there's a when you set, and I've noticed this, just these setting these things up, right? These kind of islands and putting them into relationship. I feel this like, I almost feel drunk in in um in the fate that I get to listen in and care in this way, right? And so I think that's the thing that's mostly for me, that's really at the ground of all of this. Levi, when you talked about care, that's the thing that's I could say I care, but there's also a way that how I experience it, it's more like care eyes.
Yeah.
Right? There's something really important about the notion of care or Sorge in German.
Can I say a word about care and transformation? Firstly, I want to say, Guy, thank you. And I feel like just talking about transformation before getting to the actual point, although this is an actual point too, I feel that there's kind of this interesting play of being present and thinking what to say and thinking what's appropriate and the relevance realization of that in communication. And I feel like there was a certain guyness that I embodied in what I was saying. I feel like I've been transformed by you in conversation. Before these dialogues, I never would have stopped to make an observation like that. And I feel like I was very much channeling the self of myself, the self of me, which is transformed by you, which I think why it resonated back. So I appreciate it. I appreciate your appreciation. And I think as well, I think the transformation from John about the way that we think about these things and the way that we're able to merge the care and knowledge together in a way that can be potentially transformative as well as transform me as well. And I have a lot of gratitude towards you, towards both of you in that regard. In terms of very simply, in terms of care and transformation, which we can use as kind of stand-in words for Pistis and Gnosis, which I feel a bit closer to that language.
Yeah. Okay.
There's which I appreciate that modification. I remember when I was in primary school, there was a teacher I had, he was teaching us English grammar, and I did not care about English grammar. Like I could not care about like how we're supposed to structure sentences correctly. And like there was no logic to it. It made no sense. It still doesn't. But he told me a story about a student that he had many years before. He was quite a veteran teacher. And the student had come, I grew up in Sydney, Australia, and the student had come from the country, from Australian country, and had grown up on farms and came. His father had, worked enough money in agriculture to send his child to school, and the child comes to school. And at the time, he was teaching mathematics, and he's trying to get him to understand very simple arithmetic, and the kid is just not getting it at all. And everyone else is like kind of laughing at the kid. He's a country boy. Like, what does he know? He's never going to get it. It's like really simple stuff, like 2 times 2, and like just like very simple. And what he did was, and he tells me himself, John Lennon, I should say his name because why not? Credit to him. He took out the numbers and he gave him farm objects. He says you have 2 potatoes, and you have two potatoes. Now you have them together or times by each other. How many potatoes do you have now? And right away the kid was able to respond. Yes, he talked about tractors and cows and things that the kid cared about. He cared about these things were meaningful. Yeah. Abstract numbers didn't mean anything to him. He didn't have that appreciation. But the second he was able to talk about hectares and acres and potatoes and vegetables, right away the kid rose to the top of the class in mathematics. And this deep relationship between care and understanding, care and transformation, I think is just a very simple psychological fact. I know for myself that I can pick up a book that other people can find very difficult and obtuse, but if it's something which I care about, the words just flow right into my mind. But if it's something which other people find really simple, I just don't care for the subject, it's just a blank page for me, and I can read it 100 times and not a word has gone in. This deep psychological relationship between care and the capacity for that knowledge not just to enter us, but to transform us. And I think you're right, John, in talking about how Pistis and Gnosis ultimately aren't separate categories, that they need to be blurred. Because I think that without caring, there is no capacity to absorb and be transformed by something. There's no capacity at all to be in relationship and participation with something, to identify with something, however it's being done, without deeply caring about it. And care is what pulls us into that. And I think that we sometimes kind of poo-poo, we kind of like look down on these, oh, these are like emotive, these are like, oh, that's like some sort of effeminate thing. Who needs care? Like we're talking about real, we're talking about the unknown, we're talking about the transcendent. But unless there is that, what guys talk about, unless there is that purchase of the individual, unless there is that pistis, that care, that's one side. The other side, I think, is the belief that something can happen, right? Is being open to the magic of reality, that it can transform us. And I think when I think about the Hebrew equivalent, right? In Hebrew, we have two words. We have emunah and bitachon, which kind of, they both get translated as faith and trust sometimes. But emunah is related to the Hebrew word omen, which is actually like in some sort of craft or artistry practice. Where there's a sense of faith means that you work on the belief that this thing that you're encountering may actually transform you. You work on there's an artistry in having the faithfulness that thing may affect something in you. And I think so. I want both the care that can bring to transformation, and both the sense that there's a need to if we don't believe that the universe can knock us off our feet and radically change us to be radically new people in a moment or over the course of years, it's not going to happen. And Pistis seems to me to believe in the possibility of that experience. And I'm curious to know if that maps for you.
Well, I think it does, but let me try to bring in something, and I'll try and keep it concrete again, but I think it's existential in response to what you just said. Part of what was occurring to me is the idea of Pistis says the sense of being called to care, right? Where that call isn't just an utterance, but like you said, that there's something in us that can respond to the call, the sense of being called to care. Whereas Gnosis is about what you're talking about. Gnosis is, okay, now I'm going through the transformation, and what the care discloses is being disclosed in my transformation, right?
Yes.
So I'm using a Tillichian model here. There's the call and the response notion where Pistis is, I have a genuine, real, I believe in it sense of being called to care, but then that's not enough. Right, and even in Protestantism, you make a distinction between being saved and being sanctified, right? Which is the idea that this is the faith gets me. The faith is the response to the call, but I still have to go through the Gnosis. And Christians have used that word in the past too, by the way. I have to go through the Gnosis, right, to properly respond to the call. So the Gnosis, the Pistis is the proper sense of being called. And the Gnosis is the proper sense of responding by transforming towards what calls me. How about that as a response to what you said?
Yeah, I really love that. I also know that when you're talking about Gnosis, it's so important to constantly reiterate that we're not talking about something which is simply cognitive and cerebral.
No.
I think it's so important. I think this happens in all languages. I'm just in Arabic, maharifa is to know, and knowing in this deep transformative existential sense. And I think that's important. I'm trying to think of how I'm trying to bring Buber or Jung or their discussion back into this. I'm not seeing the in. Maybe if you have something there.
Well, I mean, I see Buber. I see one of the things that the thou is existentially is a call to care that precludes my understanding, but affords me entering into that interpenetration of self-knowledge and the knowledge of the other. That's the Socratic Gnosis, right? That's what I see. But what I see Jung emphasizing is Jung is emphasizing the although, as I said, he had the psychoidal dimension. He's trying to get but what does this self-knowledge that makes me capable of responding to the numinous look like? how, like, so I get I get the call from the depths of the unconscious, but how do I, again, what does the self-knowing look like that allows me the Gnosis, the self-knowing transformation, right, towards something? How does that allow me, right, to respond to the call within? I'm sorry, this might be too simple, but are we hearing two great thinkers talking about the call within and the call without, and not properly understanding, like the way perhaps Tillich did, that they're not really separable calls? They're not identical, but they're not separable. That's a question. I don't know the answer. I'm posing it. Like I like Tillich precisely because he brings that relationship out, right? The call to care, but also right the how do you, the response to the call, and the response has to be a deeply participatory, transformative response.
Yeah, and that there's also that there's a way where the more you respond to the call, right? In some sense, the response to the call is something like the pistis, right? You get into relationship with it, where it's like that. There's that experience of, wow, you don't even have time to interpret it. It's just so meaningful in its worldness, right? And then it seems to me that there's that transformation seems to just, I don't know if I want to say naturally, but it seems like there's a logos that kind of swings back, and you go, what was that? Right. And you start to like look at that experience, and you start to usually what happens is you start to talk about it with people. But what are you doing when you're talking about that experience, right? You're, in some sense, you're drawing out, or you could say bringing the logos to the experience, right? What's interesting is the more that you do that, right? The more that you actually do that in itself affords attention to be more integrated and be able to go back into relationship. But because you have more distinctions, right? You understand more, you can see more of that horizon, or that domain, or that person, or that relationship, such that you can actually have more of the pistis, right, at a deeper and deeper level. And I would say that really, like, we're all here because there have been horizons in our lives where that keeps happening, right? And in some sense, when we get excited, right, those are moments of, like, these kind of ecstasies that come up when something opens up, or there's that insight. And I would say that there's that notion of where our conversations and our reading and our understanding that evokes from our care and is called, right, draws us into a relationship profoundly. And in understanding that relationship, right, that understanding itself allows us to go deeper into relationships.
Yes, very much. You get what's called mind-sight resonance, speaking of it psychologically. So if I'm not a psychopath, right, I have a capacity to take your perspective on my perspective. And this is Vygotsky's idea and Polanyi's idea that I can indwell you, right? And then I can see myself in a way I couldn't possibly see myself by myself, because what I do is, like Socrates talks about, how you see yourself in the eyes of the other person. And that's a very Buber thing to say, I think, right? And so you come back, and what you get is, it's simultaneously a knowing and a transformation, because what happens is I can now know myself, but I've also developed a metacognition that I properly did not have. So I both transformed the mind and know it. And that's, to me, so I indwell because I care, right? I'm called to care. And then I internalize, because that only by doing that can I properly respond. Now we make this concrete. Right here, right now, I'm picking up on your perspective. And then what I can do is I can transform my perspective so that I can more clearly reveal my mind to you. You pick up on that and you do the same thing. And then we do this mind-sight resonance. That's what's his name? Daniel, guy who wrote Mindsight. I can't remember his name, but you do this, Goleman, and you do Goleman, that's it. You do this mind-sight resonance, a reciprocal opening. By the way, just to bring back the other metaphor, that's what's happening when people fall in love.
Yep.
Hmm.
Yep.
Reciprocal disclosure.
Opening it. Yeah.
I want to. It's interesting. It's interesting that, I mean, it seems. I know, for myself at least, I have a tendency towards syncretic as a way away from analytic. I like to see how things are working together as opposed to working separately.
Sure.
And I do see that we're moving towards a merger, which is quite a fruitful one, between those two directions of the core within and the core without, and how they what you're saying now so beautifully, how they mold each other. I was just thinking though that there is, and this is slightly against my own nature, which is fine, that there is, I think, a place for both of these things to be held separately, the within and without. And we can talk about Buber as the without and Jung as the within in this regard. And I think this is something which Jung mentions in his own letters. Jung writes, and over here, this is not Jung of the Red Book and Jung of I know. This is Jung of I'm hiding behind the psychology mask. And he says, listen, I have you, and he laughs at the metaphysicians and the theologians. He says, I have patients, that are sick, that are suffering. If any of the theologians, if Buber, if you want to come, if any of the poets want to come and heal them, you're more than welcome to. But I am the doctor. I'm using the empirical method, and I have to heal these people. And when I read that initially, it seemed very lowbrow. It seemed like an unfair shot, as if like the only thing this world needs is actual scientists and healers, and there's no place for poetry and philosophers and theologians, and as if that like the entire Weltanschauung in which a society dwells in doesn't create the very issues that need to something be solved by the surgeon with their hands, So there was a bit of a narrow-minded perspective there, but now I'm seeing something a bit different, and this just dawned on me that there really is time for these two different modalities, right? When I'm working to be there for someone else in their trouble, in their problem, I'm really working to get into their self, right? This is it's not the other in that regard. It's the self of, it's their psyche which needs work, which needs healing. I need to put myself aside to be present to that. When I'm working on myself, I have the luxury to be open to taking on the realities of others. I'm thinking about this because Jung is the psychologist, Buber is the post-war theologian, who then moves to Israel-Palestine and gets very, very involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict and tries very hard to bring some sort of solutions and solace to it, with not much success at all. And the sense that there's a real other there that needs to be listened to and heard for any work to happen is really important. Whereas the psychologist can really just go, let's go into the self. And that's good for that purpose. That's right. That's the call of the self that needs to be heard and listened to. For Buber, who's trying to bring reconciliation with other, it's to hear other. I was just, not to like toot my own horn. I just got back from hanging out with some Palestinian friends that I just made in West Bank, and we were having an amazing time together. We were out on their farm. We were drinking tequila. We had a barbecue together. I eat kosher, didn't eat, but whatever. Still had an amazing time. Went for a swim in that pool. And in my mind, I was like, guys, like we're in the middle of like a conflict, a struggle. There are people suffering. I want to do work. I want to sit down. I want to record you. I want to share your narratives, tell a different story, show how like we're not enemies. We can all be humans together, and we don't have to be afraid of one another. And I wanted to tell them like how dare you guys be here like celebrating and like partying and barbecuing? Like let's get to work. Let's write. Let's work. Let's contact people. Let's video. Let's film. And they're like, Zevi, put away the camera. Like put away the phone. And I realized that like it wasn't my work there to tell the other how they're supposed to be affecting me or affecting the world around them. The role there when you're engaging with the other is just to be present with the other, to be open to hear them, to experience them, to allow them to celebrate, whatever it is. When you're not, if you're coming as a psychologist, right? If I'm coming as a doctor, be like no, like you needed, this needs to happen, these are the steps. You've ruined like, and I think there are two modalities here. I think there's a Jung modality and there's a Buber modality. The Jung modality is for when there is work to be done within the individual, and there's a space for work, that there's a space for that, and they're both transformative. But the question of that directionality is which one is the right moment for which, and it may just be that Buber and Jung didn't have to be enemies over this. The shame is that they never came into dialogue, and they both seem to bemoan that.
Yeah.
that it never transcended from disputation to dialogue.
Yeah.
And a point which is so important to both of them, to realize that there's a time for self-direction, there's a time for other direction, there's a time to listen and be present, there's a time to be active and to share, and the sense that those that we can hold Pistis and Gnosis separately, and we can allow those things to have their own time and space. I think is also an important idea.
I agree, and that I think that's Tillich's main argument, right? The individual. I think that he's trying to point to that with the individuation, participation, and he calls it a tonos because he wants to keep them distinct, but he also wants to keep them in permanent relation. I tend to think of it. I don't know if this is wrong, so it's open. But I tend to think of it the way I think of relevance realization as opponent processing that allows for mutual self-correction, right? Rather than them being atomic modes that we just switch between, right? I see them as I think that's very much how Tillich sees them. And I think that's what I like about Tillich is exactly that, right? That proposal that, right? So for me, this is different than other modal distinctions. For me, it's much more, I agree with you. There's an appropriate time and place, a finesse for each mode, but their ability to exercise finesse is not autonomous to them. It's dependent on their tonos with each other. That's what I'm proposing. That's what I'm proposing.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. There's listening to you, Zevi, talk about this. Yeah, this not having modal confusion. And in fact, there's thought about the sense of in polytheism, there's I think it's Miller pointed this out and has done some work on this. George Miller, I think it is, where he talked about that in polytheism, there's an inherent monotheism in that when you're in the temple of Apollo, you're only worshiping Apollo, right? When you're in the temple of, whatever, you're fully in worshiping that God. And that always struck me, right? That always really, really struck me. Because and it also seems to be true in terms of boundary conditions of going deep into a mode and honoring that God of that time, right? And when you're coming out, you're in the other temple, you only honor that. And that there's something essential about polytheism. There's a wisdom there, right? That I think is I'm hearing in what you're saying as well about this. But I was also wondering, John, the thing I want to also kind of come back to, what was the thing that you were talking about, about this Pistis, right? And Gnosis, that you're saying, okay, so we see how they work together.
Yes.
But we don't necessarily, it doesn't give us any more understanding of them.
Oh, well, no, well, what I meant was, I think I'm trying to remember correctly. At that point in the dialogue between us, I was using them to point to things, but I was unclear about the relationship. And
yeah,
I think Zevi did, I think the most important response was, you're not going to find the answer to your question staying in the abstract conceptual space. You have to move back to how is it being exemplified? How are we participating in it? And so that move, it's funny because it's actually, that move itself is also exemplifying what we're talking about here, right? That was a move. So I heard the call and I cared about the call that Zevi ushered. He didn't make a statement. He said, he called to me. And then I entered into a kind of gnosis. I transformed, not conceptually, I transformed my whole orientation, the way I'm coupled to the situation, and I entered into a transformative relation. So there was the call, the call, right? The call to care, that's the pistis. And then there was the entering into the Gnosis in response. And so I found that in participating in the response, I wasn't generating the answer. I was the vehicle through which the answer was emerging that I was asking for. And then I heard Zevi say, but don't let that understanding lose the relevant differences between them. And then I tried to invoke Tillich as a way of, okay, let's acknowledge the difference. Again, I'm called to it, but let's try to now understand the difference. And I proposed it's an opponent processing rather than just a simple difference or contrast. That's how I'm seeing what happened.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic.
Yeah, that was a really nice demonstrative recap as well. There's something bothering me about this debate, the Jung-Buber debate, which is that there seems to be quite simple avenues of resolution towards this. I mean, some simple metaphysics, which they're both well aware of. I mean, we're invoking new Platonic ideas of participation, of the self co-identity, of the depth of the self and the depth of the other and the depth of reality. I mean, Jung and Buber are no ignoramuses. They know these metaphysics and they indulge in them all the time, even after they claim to not be indulging in them. What's stopping? I mean, maybe we'll never know, and it may have been maybe they didn't like the shape of each other's noses. Like, it could have been anything. I mean, we hope it's not something so petty, but what's stopping them from stepping into a place where they can embrace an ontology that allows to see that they're not talking about two separate things, but talking even in this Tillichian sense that you're talking about of two poles that need to be oscillated between, depending on what's around that moment and how both of those are in relationship with one another. Is it something about the German Jew and the Swiss Protestant? Is it something about the philosopher and the some trained in psychoanalysis? Is it the scientist and the humanist? I mean, there's so much. There's as close as they are. There's also many worlds between them.
Yeah.
It seems looking at it from with the hindsight of history, and seeing all the very easy ways in which they could have come to such fruitful dialogue. With even just what we've been proposing here tonight, that didn't take too much difficulty. Why is it not getting there? You guys have any instinct, any sense?
I think one factor, it's a factor that picks up on the dimensional differences you pointed out. I'm not highly confident, but I've seen this in my milieu. I've seen people who lose some of the distinction between their theory and their identity, their position. We have this notion of position that merges theory and identity. Think about the word position. Just really let it sink into you, right? And I think that that confusion is going on in both of them. They are locked in the way I've just described. They're locked into their positions. And that makes, and you see this in academic disputes a lot. People get locked into the positions, and people from the outside are saying, but like, you basically agree. And it's, no, we don't agree at all. And you see that a lot, precisely because, so I don't know if this is right, but I'm offering it as a hypothesis. You see people become like, they identify with their position. They lose the difference between their theory and their self or their identity, and they get locked in certain ways. And both of them are invested in projects that they, I think correctly, see as trying to respond to the meaning crisis and save the world, right? So they're trying. So this is urgent, it's deep, it's profound, and then that's, like I say, I'm offering that as a hypothesis.
Yeah, that's interesting, particularly when you have these ultimate stakes at hand. What do you feel, Guy? You have a sense?
Yeah, there's a sense where I would imagine that dialogue that they were talking about, them coming into contact, just the contact, I bet they'd look at each other and the thing would happen, right? And that thing that would happen, it would be something about, they would probably go, oh, that's right. you're more complicated. Like, oh, we were talking about the same thing. Oh, we were caring about that. There's the coming into relation is, when I was younger, when I used to really struggle with judgment and resentment and conflict and stuff like that, where I used to hold things in and get resentments with people. And I would notice that, I'd get to a fight with somebody and it wouldn't resolve. And then I'd go away for 2 weeks or something. And over those 2 weeks, I would just build up a case, right?
Yeah.
About them and about me and it was everything. And then when I started in my life, started to actually kind of confront and come back into relate and talk about it, I would go and meet with them and I'd look at them, and I'd spent 2 weeks having them be a very definite position. And then I look at them and there's something about the face that is so much more than the face reveals or calls out more. It's that fundamental thing that when we really get present with somebody else, we realize that you will always outlive my conception of you.
Well,
right? There's something about the face that does that.
We have this thing of to face, like we have this as a verb, to face. Just to throw that into perhaps help you. Like we have this, we have facing as a verb, right? Yeah. So I'm imagining just those more participatory levels, right? That happen in dialogue, that could just happen in an instant in them facing one another. Yeah. Because it sounds like their debate was happening not with each other, but in response to one another with another audience reading it. Yeah. Right. Yeah. You want to talk about so many different, protective mechanisms and threats and egos and all kinds of stuff and that sets up.
There's definitely a lack of encounter because there was a lack of encounter. I think that's very point on. And Jung writes in a letter that he's very upset at Buber before waging his war against him in this journal piece. They didn't come and sit down and talk to him. Jung writes that. I came across that while reading this week. So that's definitely true. I think the importance, I was thinking of this, we're just talking about how they're both concerned with this ultimate concern, the meaning crisis. And I was thinking to myself whether and I think, Guy, you speak to this point very well, whether their debate furthered or hindered our work in coming to some sort of solace or some sort of salve to the meaning crisis. And I think that in their debate, we can learn so much, right? We can idealize what may have happened had they agreed and had they worked together and cooperated and collaborated, what would be wonderful. But even in the disagreement, and I think there's something of greatness here. And I hope I'm not romanticizing or idealizing things that shouldn't be, but there's a notion in Jewish thought that there's two types of disputations, machloket in Hebrew. There's that which is just ego, which needs to be abolished and needs to be ended. And then there's what's known as machloket l'shem shamayim, which is quite a unique, at least as far as I understand, a uniquely an original Jewish idea, that there's a actual disputation and debate for the sake of heaven, for the sake of God. And the Mishnah comments something very interesting, which is that a machloket l'shem shamayim sofo lehitkayemet will remain. Its destiny is to stay on, which you think is not like the good thing. You think that if it's a machloket, if it's a debate for the sake of heaven, then it should come to a resolution, right? It should come to some sort of facing or some sort of encounter. And the Mishnah says quite enigmatically that its fate is that it shall stand. And the idea here is that if we do believe that this great debate between these two great men was in the Jewish language, it was for the sake of a higher purpose, right? Then the debate stands and it's not resolved. It stands for us to look back at it and say, what can we learn from the debate? What can we see in our own way going forward? And I love this idea that what we can learn from it is the need to face each other, to encounter each other. Without throwing too much Judaism here, I can do that very easily. But there's a biblical prohibition. There's 613 commandments from the Bible, the way that the rabbis read the text. One of them is, I believe the biblical text is lo sinat achecha bilvavcha, to not hate your brother, your fellow in your heart, which means that there's a biblical prohibition of not for having a grudge against someone, but for not confronting someone that you have a grudge towards. Because it's natural to have grudges. We're all going to have grudges.
Yeah.
The Bible, according to the rabbis, forbids an individual from not facing the person to whom they have a grudge and tell them, I have a grudge against you for X, Y, and Z. Let's talk about it. Let's face each other. And I think so. We're not aiming to be angels. We're not looking to transcend, having negative feelings, but to stand up and say, hey, I'm not happy with the way that you've treated me. There's something that you've done in the way that I perceived it. So I think that initially my question was sort of bemoaning the fact that there was no rapprochement. Now I'm actually happy that they never came to a resolution, because there is no resolution between the debate will stand, and we will continue to learn from it. And I think one thing is we can learn that to face the people with whom, and had Buber had faced Jung, maybe in a very different story.
I think that was beautiful. I like that tradition is beautiful. It reminded me, it's not the same, but it reminds me of a convergent tradition, the Socratic tradition. Because I was going to say another thing was that they only were writing to each other. And I'm reminded of Plato's worry about writing. And that you lose something like so. And Derrida, I think, does not get Plato's point. I think he doesn't get Plato's point, right? That if you don't have, right, if you can't encounter Socrates, right? There's something lost there. So maybe that was also following up on what both of you said. The fact that they were writing to each other, they're locked into the propositional, they're locked into the literate, right? And so they lose the capacity for the Socratic. They radically lose the capacity for the Socratic. And you see Plato wrestling with this, and how he writes the dialogues, and the dialogues undermine each other and point to each other, and he's trying to get speech. So he's trying to get writing as close to speech as possible. This is what here. If we could resurrect Plato, he would love what we have here, because we have living speech, but it has the permanence also of writing, right, in this new medium.
So here's something I want to highlight, and you caught in the possibility side of it, but I think what we saw, right, what you described, Zev, about that interaction, right, is essentially like what is happening, what most people live in, right? Social media. And it's precisely this. I have a feeling we do not remotely get the consequences of this right now.
Oh, yes.
But I think it started with I talk about this in my chapter on the Dialogos book that we're going to get published, that when the answering machine comes on, and of course that's just the beginning, because then there's text and email and all these things, was the first time that if you needed to exchange information before the answering machine, you would always have to at least call the other person. There was always some element of communion, right, in facing one another, right? And there's so much that goes on, right, explicitly and implicitly in the machineries that happen when you're in the presence of another person. Answering machine comes on, then texting. All of a sudden, you introduce a choice, and you uncouple something that's never really been uncoupled before, right? And because you're uncoupling two things, and because relationship is inherently terrifying, right? Pretty much for everybody, because it's filled with ambiguity. I could say something that ends up like changing my life, and you could say something that like destroys my life and upsets everything. That's always the possibility. So if you uncouple that and we can just exchange information or something without having to make contact, my nervous system is just going to do the easiest thing. And I think that we're in so many iterations of that now.
Yes.
That I think that is a dramatic thing. And I think this what you highlighted here with where they didn't come together, what would have been possible if they would have faced one another. I just want to remind us that we're actually living in technology that supports that very thing, right?
That's a good point.
But also what you just brought up, John, is I think is really, here's the bubbling up of this, because I think what we're doing and what we're seeing on YouTube, my sense is that we're looking at something for one thing, it's one place where technology is provided. It's one place where technology isn't just leading to more technology.
Mm-hmm.
It's like what we're doing right now is like so untechnological, right? We're these long form conversations, right? But you're right, because we can record it, we can listen back to it, right?
Yes.
And we have the experience of life, and we can face each other. There's so many incredibly good things about that I also don't think we even have any idea what that will lead to. But I have a much more positive sense of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to highlight, like in some sense, I think we found ourselves putting our finger on something that's like we're deeply inside of, right? With these things.
I totally agree with that. I think that was astute. I think that was very astute.
Mm-hmm.
My friends, I'm going to need to bring this to a close, and I think that's a good place to close with. And I just wanted to thank you for all of this, and this was wonderful. And I wanted to, as I do when I'm the host, I'd like to give the two of you the chance to give any final words you want to give before we bring things to a close.
This was awesome. This was awesome. Let's see more.
Okay. Well, I can't think of a next. I mean, I've been sort of proposing the next. One of you proposed the next topic then.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have to. I think we have to bring Buber into. Sorry, we've been talking Buber. We have to bring Spinoza into the conversation. I think he's been patiently knocking at the door on the outside.
Yes.
I would love that. I would love that.
Yeah.
Sevi, would you like to host that?
Yeah, that would be a pleasure. I definitely have a soft spot for him.
Well, so do I.
I've been reading Spinoza precisely because I anticipated this coming up.
Yeah, I want to share my appreciation to both Guy and John for creating this space and for living so self-consciously and aware within this technology that we're employing to try and utilize it for the good in the face of all of the destruction and havoc that it causes. So that's there's something heroic about that. And even if we're going down on this ship, we're going down together, and we're trying to make the last moments ones that are positive and uplifting and encased in care and friendship in ways that are transformative. And I feel transformed by these continually. So thank you both.
Yeah, ditto.